Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. So, first off, a word of thanks to Biscayne Brewing Company. It's not always that a brewery will open its doors in the middle of the week to an event of this caliber, so we're grateful for their hospitality. We're also grateful for all of you for coming here right after work before you're on your way back. And for those of you who had to fight through the Miami traffic, a double thank you. So the purpose of the Economical of Miami is to really do three things. First is to convene people around significantly important economic, financial, and public issues that affect the economy, that affect their lives, that affect their companies, and that affect the ability of Miami to grow and develop into a thriving American city. The second role is to connect all of you from a variety of sectors, not just the economic sector, the financial sector, but also the entrepreneurial sector, the real estate sector, the civic sector, the charitable sector, the intellectual capital sector. And the third is to foster collaboration, the third C, where by connecting and by convening our members and our affiliates around critical questions and critical ideas, we can generate the type of interaction and thought leadership that will contribute to Miami and contribute to the continued growth and development of the city. So that's really why this organization exists and why we've been so blessed to partner with organizations like the American Enterprise Institute to connect ideas and application. And so you are going to hear from Tobias Peter, who is an expert on sustainable housing and the issues of public housing. And he will talk about his tremendous background in looking at different cities, different models, and a lot of the larger issues involved with affordable housing and the challenge of affordable housing. But you're also going to hear from someone who's actually done it, Michael Liu, who has an extensive public service record, not only as an elected official in the great state of Hawaii, but also as a cabinet member for President Bush, and has also served as the Miami-Dade County Housing Director and briefly the City of Miami Housing Czar. So in terms of applying those ideas, applying the data, and making something work, Michael has been at the cutting edge of solving those problems. I'm sure many of you work in one form or another in the real estate space. You're affected by the real estate economy, as you can see from the cranes. And Miami is going through one of its dynamic building phases. But what many people don't know is that just a few years back, Miami was only built up to 10% of what's allowable in the zoning code. Meaning, the city of Miami, not the county, but the city itself, still had 10x more capacity for building growth, whether it's commercial or housing or what have you. That's it. That's an incredibly astounding number. But it's a number that I would ask you just to keep in mind as we discuss the issues of creating and incentivizing affordable housing, sustainable housing, and an overall housing market that works for everyone. So thanks so much. I'm going to hand this over to Chris Grosso of the American Enterprise Institute.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you, Francisco. So just really quickly, you didn't come here to listen to me, so I want to be very brief. Just give you 30 seconds on what the American Enterprise Institute is for those of you who are less familiar. So the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI, is a public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., which is where Tobias and I flew down from. For those of you who are less familiar with what a think tank is, it's basically a collection of scholars like Tobias who do research every single day with the ultimate aim of influencing public opinion and public policy. What differentiates AEI, because there's countless think tanks in Washington, D.C., what differentiates AEI is the independence of its scholars. And so we do not take institutional positions at AEI, and Tobias and the other scholars are not required to toe the line of our president or any political party. We do not take money from the federal government or any country, and the scholars do not do their own fundraising. And so that inherent conflict of interest that might exist at most other think tanks does not exist at AEI. And that gives them credibility. It gives them that credibility to influence public opinion and public policy. We're the premier center-right think tank in Washington, D.C., and so while we don't take institutional positions, most of our scholars are fighting on behalf of free enterprise and free market solutions to the most challenging problems that our country is facing today. And my name is Chris Grosz, and I'm responsible for the Miami community amongst a number of other metro areas around the country. We do really fun events probably every other month or so in Miami. We'll take a break in the heat of the summer coming up, and we'll start again in the fall after this. But if any of you are interested in getting more involved with AEI and joining our local events, please talk to me or many of the members who are in the crowd. We'd love to have you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tobias and Michael.
All right, thank you, Chris and the Economics Club of Miami, Francisco, Jeremy, thank you for having me. Also, great venue that you picked. As a native German, I really feel at home at the brewery, so thank you for making this happen. And also, before I begin, I must also say a big thank you also to our Enterprise Club members. AEI is really a great place, as Chris said, because of the support that we receive from our donors. So thank you for making that happen. So we're going to be talking a little bit about housing affordability. And of course, this is becoming a larger national issue now. And I already spoken to some people here, and we're in the process of buying a home, but can't find anything or being priced out. Other folks are asking, well, where are my kids and grandchildren going to live? And if they're priced out here, I may only get to see them once or twice per year. Others are asking, well, our first responders and teachers and nurses, where are they going to be able to live? Do they have to drive in 1-2 hours to get into the city where they work? And by that time, it might be too late till they show up at my doorstep when I actually need them. And then for many younger folks and many immigrants, low-income households, they're just basically asking, well, will I get my shot at the American dream? And so there's this debate at the national, but also at the state and local level in terms of what should we do? And should we rely more on government interventions to build more affordable housing? Or should we unleash market forces to build more market rate housing? And to chart the best path forward, we really need to understand how we got in this position. And we need to address the root causes. And to me, it really boils down to supply and demand. Shocking, we're at an economics club event where we talk about supply and demand. But on the supply side, we've really broken the market's ability to respond to the price signal. And this all started back literally 100 years ago in the 1920s when the federal government started implementing zoning policies across the country, and where we limited large swaths of buildable land to only single-family detached housing, rather than sticking with the housing variety type that was so prevalent before then, and which produced housing abundance for the masses. Then there was also the rise of the NIMBY movement in the 1950s. It all started out in San Francisco, and that really started to replace individual property rights with communal rights. And of course, it took away, or it created discretion, uncertainty on the part of developers and builders, which of course added to the cost so that fewer projects started to pencil out. And then in the 1970s, the rise of the environmental movement, which of course added additional costs that made it all worse. And not to say that some of those regulations were certainly needed, but maybe the pendulum has swung a little bit too far. And then, of course, we had the great financial crisis. And generally what happens after recessions or during recessions is that the building industry takes a huge plunge. And it takes time to recover. The problem was that the devastation of the great financial crisis was so large that it's just taking the building industry a very long time to recover. But if you look at the slope of the recovery, it's pretty much the same slope that we've seen in prior recoveries. But because we started from such a low point, we've been underbuilding for far too long. And of course, as housing supply got more restricted, what did the federal government decide to do? Well, we need to increase more demand. And of course, what's going to happen is obvious: prices are going to go up and rents is going to go up. And that started with looser underwriting during the 1990s and the 2000s. We also had monetary stimulus in response to the great financial crisis with the explicit goal of rising asset prices. You see it in the stock market, but you also see it in the housing market. And also another thing is that many cities have been laser focused on creating jobs, and especially high-paying jobs, and rightfully so. But what has often been an afterthought was creating the housing for the workers, and ultimately more demand against the limited supply leads to higher prices. So now the choice is more government interventions to build more affordable housing, or markets to unleash markets to build more market rate housing. And the former approach is really exemplified by California. And California has taken a particular form of NIMBYism called banana. Anyone know what banana stands for? No. It stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, banana. And it's not 100% accurate, because they are building a few houses in California. They're building the very expensive, we call them McMansions. Those are houses selling for multiple millions. 4,000, 5,000 square feet large, and nothing wrong with building them. But those are the only ones that you can build because the margins are larger. And then they're building a few heavily subsidized affordable housing units that are really expensive housing units made affordable through subsidies. And California is routinely spending $700,000 or more per unit, affordable housing unit. And in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, it is routinely over $1 million. And at the same time, in the broad middle of the price spectrum, they're not building much for the broad masses. So what's the outcome of all of this? Well, California has the highest home prices and highest rents, along with Hawaii. 4 million people have left California over the last 30 years. The middle class has been hollowed out. Kids are leaving within their parents' basement. And it has the highest rate of homelessness of any state in the country. The alternative is unleashing the market. And I oftentimes tell people, let's not talk about housing here, because there's a great article in The Atlantic that says housing breaks people's brains. And if you ask people, what do you think about housing? Is there a housing problem? They say, no, there's no problem, because when I drive around, I see cranes everywhere. So there cannot be a housing shortage, right? Or they say, well, what do you think if we're going to build more housing? What do you think is going to happen to prices? If you ask them about cars, they say, well, if you build more cars, the price of cars is going to go down. Same with clothing, same with cell phones. With housing, people think, well, the price is going to go up. So it really breaks people's brains. And so what we tell people is, like, look at the car market. And at the car market, which is a functioning market, maybe think about the car market before the pandemic, where we were building new cars, but we also have a lot of used cars. And we were building a lot of expensive cars, the Ferraris, and nothing wrong with building that. But we were also building a lot of cars for the broad masses, for the middle of the income distribution. Those were your Toyota Camrys, your Honda Civics. Those are cars that sell for $25,000, $30,000. Very attainable cars for the broad masses. But no one has so far proposed tax credits for car manufacturers to build cars for people earning 60% of area median income or less. It's not needed, right? Why is it not needed? Well, because people buy these newer cars in the middle of the price spectrum, and then they sell the cars that they've been driving for 3, 4, 5 years, and they sell those cars to someone who has driven another car for 8, 9, 10 years, and cars that way filter down the income spectrum until everyone in this country who wants a serviceable car has a serviceable car. And so it doesn't cost any money through this market rate approach. And the other beauty of this is that it's really, the situation that we ended up today is really a self-inflicted wound. And it's not a market failure, it's a government regulatory failure. We can dig our way out of this by unleashing market forces. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more about examples from around the country where we've seen that this approach has actually worked. But Michael, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, thank you, Tobias. And I want to thank our introducers for also explaining what a think tank is, because, of course, here in Miami, we don't think, right? We just drink and do. That's the way we approach things. I've seen the tug and pull of the spacing battle between government sector versus private sector, both from the national level. When I spent many years in Washington, both in USDA and then at HUD, both involving, in one case, the old Farmers Home Administration and rural housing, and the similar programs that they have at HUD associated with public and Indian housing, where I was assistant secretary there. And then, obviously, I've done a lot of work in the private sector on the financing side. And, we can get into a big debate about government action, government financing programs, whether the low-income housing tax credit program is really helping or whether it's just allowing developers and syndicators feeding at the trough. But more practically, I think a lot of these issues regarding costs and developing housing is not ideological. It's basic management issues. There's so many processes in government, federal, state, and local, where there are no consequences that face government officials, government bureaucrats, if they don't meet their own deadlines. Whether it says should be done in 10 days or 5 days or 30 days, the clock expires, nothing happens. Now, there are a few examples. Where there are hard deadlines, and you know what? The world hasn't fallen down because of them. But at all levels in government, including our own Miami-Dade County, and I know them well, I can tell you one of the classic headaches of developers here, as well as in other jurisdictions, is the amount of time it takes for an application, whether it's a competitive application, whether it's administrative site plan reviews through RER, whether it is a more specific zoning application. You talk about 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, 2 years to get something from start to getting something in the ground. You are talking tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional costs per unit, not just per project, but per unit. A great example is, let's say, implementing Order 8-4 in Miami-Dade County. That is the process that supposedly governs private sector involvement in looking at government land and proposing that they may want to do something. Proposal comes in within 5 days, supposed to get distributed from the mayor's office to the head of the Internal Services Division. Within 5 days of that, he's supposed to distribute it to all the department heads and say, is this proposal for this parcel of land something that we should take a look at? And do you have any other ideas or projected uses for that land? That's supposed to be done in 10 days. And then within 30 days, the response is supposed to come back. All of that, if you add it all up, on average, is supposed to be about 40 days. That does not happen now. The average is anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. And although the exact days and timelines are stated in the law, in Miami-Dade County law and the implementing order, there are no consequences to ISD, the mayor's office, Public Housing and Community Development, the department I used to run. And everyone is busy. And the county is shorthanded. But that is the kind of problem that we are facing. So I've talked to a lot of commissioners, both city and with the county, and said, listen, if you're going to put deadlines of any kind in regards to the development process, put consequences to your people for not following those deadlines, whether it means assume approval if no response within the time frame, or maybe there should be some kind of economic penalties to the county for not approving those applications in the time frames allowable. That's just one example among many with Tobias. At the federal level, it's sad. In May of 2022, 2 years ago, the Biden administration, I was very excited. And I'm a Republican because they put out an actual housing supply action plan, supply and demand, right? They had, it's hard to count, but more or less had 35 initiatives, okay? By my count, being very generous, okay? Only 9 of them have occurred. The balance have not. And these deal with issues like accessory dwelling units, like incentives to local governments to be more flexible in regards to zoning and approval processes for building. Funny, I didn't see any incentives going to Ron DeSantis for Live Local and our local folks up in Tallahassee. But those are the kinds of, again, non-ideological, not a Republican idea, not a Democrat idea, but if only government, to the extent that they are going to be involved, no matter what, even in the unleashing of the private sector, that unleashing requires government action. They need to have people who understand how to manage, people who will be good to their word, and then writing into the legislation and regulation consequences to not doing what they say they should be doing. So, we could go on for a lot of things, and maybe this opens up to some examples that you have, some success stories, but also where you might see some improvement.
Yeah, no, great observations there, Michael, and I'm just going to build on some of them. Ultimately, I think this is zoning and land use. Those are state and local issues. They should not be addressed at the federal level. The federal government created this problem literally 100 years ago when it started pushing zoning policies across the country and using the bully pulpit. And hence, I think at the state and local, these issues should be addressed, and they can be addressed. And there have been a lot of states and cities that have been moving in this direction. And if you go back 5 years, the progress has really been stunning. But what we've been seeing is on what has worked, and we have found over 15 case studies that we have researched. Some of them, more recent reforms that were implemented, like ADUs in California. Others really dating back to the 1930s. And what we found was that it often comes down to what we call the housing abundance success sequence. And this housing abundance success sequence, it has worked in places like Seattle, so a very, very high cost area. It works in Houston, where you have home prices roughly in the middle. But it also worked in Philadelphia, where if you think back to 2000, home prices were in the doldrums. So it literally works anywhere. At the same time, the New York Times editorial board, one of the editorial board members, he had now 2 op-eds in the Wall Street Journal. And he has been praising us, and he has been saying, this is what they've come up with, this is really the solution. And at the same time, it was just not as luck will have it, we also had an op-ed in the Sarasota Observer, more center-right newspaper, that also endorsed this idea. So I think it also spans the ideological spectrum. So what do I mean by this housing abundance success sequence? And it starts by recognizing that this filtering process that we see with cars, with phones, with clothing, where older stuff gets passed down, that also applies to housing. And particularly California's HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department, does not recognize filtering. So it needs to start with the recognition that filtering works. And then we need to put in place policies like we need to make the home building process by right. That's very important. We need to follow the KISS principle, the keep it short and simple. And that applies to the permitting process. It applies to the cost, and it applies to land use. So for the permits, as Michael said, there are some great experiments out there in California where they have put in place shot clocks. So if you don't hear from the city within 60 days, 90 days, consider the permit approved. Some cities have also implemented pre-approved design standards. So if you pick one of those design standards, consider it approved. On the cost front, maybe don't require LEED Platinum, maybe go a step below. And then on the land use front, similarly, Los Angeles City has over 1,000 different different zoning codes.
Oh.
Guess how many Japan has? Anyone want to wager a guess? How many zoning codes there are in Japan?
0.
There are 12. I think Australia has even fewer. Australia and New Zealand, one of the two. But you see, why does Los Angeles need over 1,000 when Japan has 12?
Well, let me comment about Japan. And I think it's true that of all the major metropolitan areas in the world, the only metropolitan area that does not have a significant housing affordability crisis is Tokyo. Now, the image of Tokyo is that you have wall-to-wall people and that, boy, how can they live there and suffer there? But they do, and that's because of this fact that Tobias mentioned. There are very few government manufactured regulatory issues regarding zoning and land use. They let the private sector work with each other with some involvement for health and safety on part of the government, but you don't have this overwhelming micromanaging of the development process in Tokyo, of all places.
And on Tokyo, I mean, I've actually done a case study on Tokyo, and you oftentimes hear the pushback about Tokyo being, well, Japan is shrinking in population size. Well, if you look at Tokyo, the population of Tokyo has grown leaps and bounds. And at the same time, if you look at rents are a fraction of what they are in San Francisco, in Paris, in London, all these other larger metropolitan areas. Why? Because they've been adding to the housing supply entirely through private means, no government interference. It works if you unleash market forces. So coming back to the housing success sequence, what do you need to do? Live local, I think, is a great concept. Definitely has a lot of promise. It is relatively new. Haven't really seen much happening yet, but it's also still things are in the work, getting tweaked at the state level. But one case study that we found was in Anaheim. In Anaheim, the area between Disney World and the Angel Stadium. And if you go back to 2004, they had an area there that was entirely consisted of industrial and commercial areas. They had warehouses, they had some low-yielding offices. Parcels were assessed at about $6 million. And then over the time, they've put in place a Live Local Act for this particular area. And the area was completely razed to the ground, and they started building multifamily apartments, and they started building townhomes. And of course, a multifamily apartment is assessed at $160 million versus the $6 million property that was on there before. So from a city perspective, that is really a win-win because you are dramatically increasing your property taxes. And at the same time, they've added 4,500 housing units over the span of about 18 years in a relatively small area of about 1 square mile. If they had done this for the whole city or for more areas, the supply response would have been much, much, much larger. And so Live Local, great act. You're gonna get mostly rental apartments that are in very attractive locations, smaller units, about probably on average about one bedroom, that are great for kind of dual income, no kids folks.
Yep. I think what is exciting in regards to what's happening is the examples that Tobias gave, Seattle, Portland, these are not red areas from a political standpoint. And you look at the battle going on between Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami when it comes to rapid transit zones. The city and some of its great leaders, equating Miami-Dade County to Russia invading Ukraine. And then, of course, when Live Local passes, we see the invectives going back between cities and counties against Tallahassee. But that's, to me, a good sign that people of all backgrounds are thinking about how do we solve this problem of supply and demand. And yes, there are concerns about local neighborhoods and livability and history. But history moves on. And having that kind of debate in both red and blue areas and metro areas is a good thing. I came across a relatively recent Pew, a charitable trust poll about policies that most Americans can agree to in regards to affordable housing. And it seems so common sense. This was from November of 2023. Allow apartments near train or bus stations or major job centers. 81% yes. Allow more affordable housing or dorms on church or college land. 81% yes. Allow apartments near offices, stores, or restaurants. Yes, 75%. Allow conversion of basement or attics into apartments. 73%. Allow adding apartments over garage in a backyard. ADUs, essentially, 72%. All of that seems to be things that a lot of people can agree on. So I think, now is the time for people who support those ideas, who are concerned about affordable and workforce housing, get involved and support candidates, support organizations that are going to support these types of changes. It shouldn't take 5 years for any of these to become law and to become implementable. It can happen, and it should happen. There is consensus there in the community. So while I'm sad on the one hand, because as now on the private sector and the developer, I have to stand in line, to wait for my permit or to try and explain to that zoning person in RER or the city of Miami what's actually happening. I'm still hopeful, and I think it can be done.
Yeah, and Michael, there's actually one more solution on this from the list that you just quoted, and that's what we call light touch density. And by light touch density, what do we mean? We really mean moderately greater density. So not going the high rise that you would do here in Miami City, but this is more a solution for Miami-Dade, for example, or the further you go out into the larger metro, where you allow ADUs, accessory dwelling units, granny flats, or you allow duplexes, so 2 units on a parcel that was previously only allowing 1 unit. You allow townhouses, so anything up to 8 units per parcel, where previously you would only allow 1. And we really think that there's a lot of, as you said, you can build a great coalition around this, because it appeals to all sides of the political spectrum. It appeals to where I'm coming from, on the market side, on the center right, where this is entirely private sector driven. It doesn't require any government subsidies. It appeals to the left because it's oftentimes you can talk to them in the language of walkability, and you are building very green new housing, meaning green in terms of environmental standards. You're tearing down an older housing unit that is leaking energy. You're replacing it with a state-of-the-art one. You're reducing vehicle miles traveled because you're not sprawling further out. You're actually adding a little bit more density. You are appealing zoning sorted history, which was really put in place to price out Black Americans and also Eastern and Southern European immigrants that were seen at the time as undesirable. So you're repealing that. It appeals to the business community because family sizes have shrunk, and businesses would do a lot better if they had more density around them, because then that drives more foot traffic. It appeals to all these different spectrums, and from these reforms that we've seen, these pro-housing movements all across the country, generally they have been bipartisan. So they have had support from the left and the right, and I think that's giving this movement a lot of running room for the future.
Let me raise, however, one, cautionary flag. And this goes to the segment of our population, maybe some of it is of self-interest, that is the older, some senior population, okay, that are on fixed incomes, okay, that don't necessarily get the increase to their social security or pension or from their savings to track the allowable increases in rents for even the subsidized units. And that is really an area that government and the private sector are going to have to think about. I think insurance companies are going to have to get involved. They're going to have to be a different kind of insurance that's going to look at housing and cost of housing and operations there. I think there's going to have to be, regardless of who gets elected to the White House, they're going to have to force a discussion between Health and Human Services and HUD so that the subsidies for medical services can be used for housing and vice versa, some sort of way that where both subsidies can be combined along with private sector resources to maintain and ensure that the elderly that are in need of assistance are going to be able to sustain and not become an even bigger burden on our health system. So I think that's one area where there is going to have to be government involvement. And maybe there are some smart people in the realm of insurance that are thinking about how they might be able to intersect with this area of housing and rent and or mortgage assistance.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a role for vouchers, particularly in the until we've unleashed the private sector and the private sector has built more housing. I mean, I think all these solutions. I think we can find them, but the larger one is really we need to build more housing, because if we don't build any housing, prices and rents are just gonna march higher and higher, and ultimately people are gonna be priced out no matter how much government subsidies you're gonna provide them. But one more point about self-interest, because that's really an important one. When we studied reforms that were put in place and that have worked in Palisades Park, New Jersey, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Palisades Park, New Jersey. It's a small borough across the George Washington Bridge from Manhattan. And due to a zoning quirk in the 1930s, they always allowed 1-unit and 2-unit parcels by right. And nothing really happened there until the 1990s when home prices started rising, and it was a signal to the market, you need to provide more housing. And they started tearing down single-family detached homes and replaced them with duplexes. And today, over 50% of the single-family housing stock in Palisades Park has been converted to duplexes. And the great point about Palisades Park is that it always had one of the highest tax rate of the surrounding boroughs in that area. Always had one of the highest tax rates. But now, because they were able to build more housing and they were able to broaden the tax base, and the commercial strip is doing much, much, much better, they were able to gradually lower tax rates. And now today, Palisades Park has the lowest tax rates of all the boroughs in that neighborhood. So, by encouraging these type of reforms, you can also appeal to the NIMBYs that are those people that are, a little bit on the fence, and point them towards, you can find something for everyone that appeals to them, just to peel them away from the NIMBY opposition to get them in your camp, or at least to stand on the sidelines.
Well, I think, Tobias, we touched on a lot of points. I think we have a lot of examples that certainly can be brought to the bear. And I think, just some Q&A.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, you've got a question, we're going to get a mic to you so we can keep it on the video.
Hi, thanks guys. My name is Will. I have a question. So I'm interested in starting up a YIMBY organization in town. And I'm wondering about the actual, just as like a membership of lay people, as an interest group. And it makes me, I thought of it because there's this important article in the 1970s, the beginning of the great downzoning planning article called The City as Growth Machine, that talked about how urban politics and urban institutions should, in theory, have this virtuous flywheel of the relationship between the builders, lawyers, the bankers, the insurers, the construction workers. And in Miami and in Florida more generally, I think we do have that. This is a city that has this culture of Henry Flagler. The state is largely in the economic history of real estate building cycles. And yet, if you talk to the average person who doesn't work in this industry, there's a lot of distrust about local government. There's a lot of skepticism. They think, oh, the politicians are bought and paid for. When you go to a permitting hearing, there's a couple of representatives of the developer on one side, and there's a bunch of cranky NIMBYs who think that this is all not on the up and up. And so I'm wondering, like, so when Governor DeSantis signs Love Local, he doesn't make a big deal on it. He doesn't trot this out on his presidential campaign. He doesn't push this publicly. Do you think that zoning reform, upzoning the union movement is better served with the sort of technical insider game, or is there room for, like, mass movement, bringing in the crowd of young people who can't buy a house to the permitting hearing?
I'm of the latter thought right now, that today, because of the housing crisis across the United States, whether or not you're talking about rural America or big metropolises, metropolitan America, the issue is ripe for somebody on the national level, preferably running for president, to really shed light on this issue. Unfortunately, I think it may miss this cycle as much as things have really come to a head, because you have, candidates on both sides that have very personal views on how to run a campaign and how to win a campaign. So we're stuck with it. But perhaps in competitive races for U.S. Senate, U.S. House, governorships, housing is on everyone's tip of the tongue. And I think it's right. You've been around the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need people to show up at these hearings. And it used to be that the NIMBYs were the only ones showing up. So the elected official thought, well, I have 10 NIMBYs here. Why would I vote against this? Why would I stick my neck out? Let me give you one example from Austin, which recently just passed housing reforms. And at the hearing where this was debated, they had about 100 people show up. 45 were NIMBYs, 45 were YIMBYs. They were yes in my backyard. And that gives politicians the cover to vote with what they think is right. And this is exactly what happened in Austin. So you need to establish a ground game, and you need to get people to go out. But then you also need to be smart about it. You need to build coalitions. You need to identify the right people. So that starts with the mayors, the council, the building departments. As Michael said, building departments can be a huge stumbling block. But if you convince them, they can really move. They can really move the needle. And that's what we've been hearing across the country, is that once you convince them, they can really move at light speed. At the same time, you need to get the business community involved, because this is really good for this is good for them. They should want this. Same with the kind of, if you can lower tax rates, that's a great approach. And to the builder aspect, this is primarily going to be benefiting the large builders. So with Live Local, yes, I think this is going to be helping kind of the more established firms. But if you combine it with this light touch density approach, you're going to find thousands of small-scale builders coming out of the woodwork. And that happened in Seattle, where they've built 20,000 housing units, was built by thousands of small-scale builders. They were doing, no one of those builders had a market share greater than 1%. It just shows you that, these are opportunities that the private sector responds to if you get it right. And one last point about the national politics. I think the issue that we're really facing is that public housing in the 50s, 60s, 70s that really poisoned the well. And when you talk about affordable housing, it really means subsidized government public housing. And a lot of people, I talked to my colleagues about this, they are older, they remember growing up in these cities and they realize the damage that this has done to their communities. They don't want that. So if you, kind of focus the conversation around these smaller townhomes and these small scale builders, I think ultimately that's the middle ground that hopefully, maybe not this cycle, but maybe next cycle, we can build a coalition and move this forward.
I wonder if you've done any work. So, as a homeowner myself, I feel viscerally conflicted because as a homeowner, my incentive is to restrict new building because a huge proportion of most of American families of their net worth is tied up with their home, right? So their incentive is to restrict further building so that their property price goes up. That's worked tremendously well over the course of the last 2 decades. We've seen enormous wealth effect for families in the US as a result of that. So we end up with a tension between those who don't own property and those who own property in terms of their principal incentive for net worth and affordable housing. And I wonder if you've done any work around that, because ultimately people who control have the greatest power. Those are those that pay real estate taxes, who typically are the people who own property that want to restrict further building. And I wonder if there is a direct linkage in the restrictive housing zoning from people like me going, I really don't want any more building in my neighborhood.
So you're absolutely right. And that's why the NIMBYs used to show up. And they were the loudest ones. But I think the attitudes are a little bit changing, especially with the older generation, particularly if you ask them, well, where are your kids and grandchildren going to live? And do you want them to own homes at some point? Do you want them to be able to start families, which oftentimes, homeownership is a crucial first step on that ladder. If I could tell you, well, if you allow more housing to be built, your property taxes could go down. Maybe that would sway you to at least, instead of going on the barricades, you're going to be a little bit more mellow about it. But then the other thing is really to understand that if you allow moderately higher density, it's not that you're going to be in your neighborhoods that you're going to be putting up really crappy housing, right? If you are living, in a neighborhood where the average home is, let's say, $1 million, no developer is going to come in, tear it down, and build homes for $250,000 in that neighborhood. I mean, what we found in Seattle, they tore down $1 million home and replaced it with 4 townhomes, each valued $1 million. So, it's at the same price point. So you're going to be attracting roughly people of the same income spectrum as you are. It's not, that you're putting in a high-rise subsidized housing, public housing development that's going to change your neighborhood. And the other thing, what we found is with this light touch density, it's very gradual. The development is occurring at about 2% per year. All the case studies that we've done, it's about 2% per year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but over 10 years, that's 20% of the housing stock converted. So since it's gradual, it gives you time to get used to this. I would throw it back to you. Any of those, we haven't done any surveys on this or focus groups, but, any of these arguments resonate with you?
They absolutely do. And I look at the situation and it's kind of frightening when you live in a house that goes up 50% in 18 months. Okay, you feel this is not a natural outcome, and this doesn't feel like it's actually good for Miami, although it helps my balance sheet ultimately. And what is the outcome of this? What we're seeing, as you know, in Miami-Dade is that we're having a net outflow of citizens. Right? Sure, people coming in are wealthier, but now it's getting harder and harder to get any form of sort of labor within, and so we're actually seeing knock-on effects. So I don't want to hog the mic, but that's the feel though.
I mean, the other thing is look at California, right? Has it worked out for them? Do you really want to turn into California?
No, thank you.
And real quickly, the conflict that you feel is the conflict of, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of residents that see change in the neighborhood. And having been involved in, I can't tell you how many meetings with residents and developers, both on a small scale and a big scale, it's never 100% one way or the other. There's always room for some compromise. And despite what you may read in the Herald and whatever Doug Hanks wants you to buy or wants you to read in his Instagram or Twitter account, it's never that bad. And generally speaking, the developer community, despite what many people think, if they have never really met or have never really had to work with the developer, they're willing to listen and willing to make adjustments to deal with the type of conflicts that you feel. And that has to be put in the context of this supply and demand issue and looking at the long term for not only yourself, but your family, for your children, grandchildren, etc.
Hi. So I go back home and quickly. Japan has a horrible housing rate crisis. It's just different. They just have like millions of houses that are empty because people cannot afford to run them. But that's not my question. I actually come from a different perspective. I think part of the problem is the obsession in the U.S. and other countries to own property. Like if you look at Germany, Switzerland, where like 40% plus of the population rent their properties, or they don't rent it for 1 year. Some people have lived in the rental homes 40 years. It's a completely different model. So here, when we talk about building housing next to the subway or the tube, whatever, my trainer lives in one of those. It's like a tiny one bedroom. Like we are not building rental places that can be rented for 40 years to a family, and there are no incentives for people to rent. So isn't that part of the policy discussion? Should we try to build affordable or whatever housing that is just for renting long term? Like in Germany, there are buildings in Germany that are only rentals. So they're only they're only rentals, and the people live there, all their lives.
There is actually a fair amount of choice in terms of size of units in the affordable and workforce space. And especially here in Florida now with the impact of Live Local, with RTZ zoning, etc., there's more ability on the part of developers to build that larger apartment or townhome. 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, even in some cases 3 baths. You're not going to have 4 bedrooms. I'm sorry, that's just not where things are going to go. And there are a lot of the affordable and workforce housing developers here in South Florida, unlike other places, are actually in it for the long term. My firm, Swerdlow, Mr. Brantley's firm, Integral, Atlantic Pacific, Related Urban Development Group, these are actually companies that are into the long haul. And I'm not just talking about 15 years, I'm talking about 25, 30, 45, 50 years, and they plan their economic viability on those long terms. So to the extent that they're looking to keep their housing stock as rental, with the restrictions that are associated with the government subsidies that flow through them, I think you do have in that market that ability for a family to stay in rental housing for an extended period. I agree with you that in America, overall, there is this fixation with owning a home and thinking that that is the only way to build wealth and go to heaven. Not true. I mean, despite the significant increases that you get occasionally, maybe every 7 to 10 or 15 years in real estate prices and exponential growth if you're a homeowner, that is not the normal case over time. It's much smaller than that. And frankly, if you pay attention to the stock market, you will make a lot more money by investing all that money that you're paying rent to the mortgage company for 30 years in the stock market. So you're right. I think the politicians are to blame to a lot of extent because they believe that somehow home ownership is the holy grail of American life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the realtors really sold, right, the American dream as, owning a home is part of the American dream. Let me tell you, as a German and as a very frugal German, my wife calls me cheap. I see the point about homeownership, particularly for lower income people, as the forced savings aspect, right? That's really a way of building wealth. The Germans, I think, generalizing here, grossly generalizing, but I think the Germans, they would be probably investing in saving more of their money. That's not, because we don't like to spend it. That's not automatically taken out of your paycheck. That's one point. The other point I want to make is, we can build all the housing in the world, but we also need to make sure that the people that are getting into these houses, that they have the staying power. And particularly in Miami, I think we've learned the hard way in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, where we extended housing to people that could not withstand the shocks. And when we looked at the data, we found that there's actually a very simple way of increasing the staying power of individuals so they could build wealth. And that is, instead of going with your traditional 30-year mortgage, you go with a 20-year mortgage. And what we found was that the people that had 20-year mortgages had half the default rate of those that had 30-year mortgages, controlling for everything else, all the observable characteristics in the aftermath of the financial crisis. That's huge. And that applies to people with 660 FICO scores or below, where you cannot make the argument, well, the ones that are getting 20-year loans, they are just having they like the savings aspect. So I think we need to also invest in better loan products, and we have a proposal out there. We call it the LIFT program, the Low Income First Time Homebuyer program. That was picked up by Senator Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, and we've worked with his team as they were developing this program. So it's really an AI idea that's now being pushed by 5 or 6 Democratic senators. Hopefully this gets passed eventually. But it's not just, the forced savings aspect, and especially if we can combine it with shorter loan terms, I think that would go a long way for building wealth for lower income people. And then to your point about the structure types, I agree with you. I think we need more housing type diversity. That was normal back in the 1920s and earlier. It just became out of fashion because of the government. And in Seattle, when we looked at the homes that got built around transit, those were the high-rise, very expensive land, more expensive to build because you need elevators and you're going higher in the air. Those were on average 1 bedroom. So those are not, for families with children, those are not great apartments, especially if you're planning to stay there for a longer term. On the other hand, the townhomes that they were building by these smaller scale builders, they were on average 2.5 bedrooms. So, that gives you a little bit more flexibility to stay there longer term.
Hi, thank you all for being here tonight. I would say I'm a supporter of free markets. I'm a supporter of YIMBY, not NIMBY. I'd like to see more housing, more affordable housing, have more people come here. I came here from somewhere else. I'd be happy to have more people come here from somewhere else. However, when I did come here in 2007, many of these towers did not exist, and they've all gone up. We've had a lot more housing units go up, but the roads are still the same width, and traffic has gotten a lot worse. So without having any NIMBY or banana policies, what would you all say about the responsibility that the local governments should put on developers to make contributions as part of their business plans to building these towers, to improving infrastructure, whether it be public transportation, like on Metro Movers or Metro Rail, or widening the roads in some way? Yes.
But as we all know, those of us who live here in South Florida and Miami-Dade County, traffic is, as big, in some cases, bigger an issue than housing. Just getting to and from work, and to and from your home, to and from school, what have you, is a challenge. And it comes down to resources. There was poor planning, I think, in Miami-Dade County when they passed the hat penny tax back in the day, we're 20 years ago now. And, whoever gets elected to the BCC, the Board of County Commissioners, they end up fighting each other and either blaming each other or blaming the past for, that money not being spent correctly to deal with our infrastructure, as well as the stock being purchased, whether it be for Metro Rail or for the actual bus system. But I think there is a greater awareness now on the part of the politicians, the policymakers, that they do have to be smarter in how they allocate the funds associated with infrastructure. Developers will tell you that we believe we pay our fair share, okay? And we do pay a lot of money for that infrastructure. Now, how it's spent to deal with the impacts, that is a lot of times out of our control. And it's left then to the city engineers, the county engineers, to figure out how to make that happen. And I think similar to the process issues I spoke about earlier, they plague the transportation departments of both county, city, and state as much as they do the other departments. And they have to improve on their acts too. And there's going to be transition. I hear that the current head of the county's Department of Transportation, I don't know if it's public yet, but he's been here for less than a couple of years, and now he's moving out to Boston. So that's going to create, some turmoil within the department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But absolutely, transportation is an issue. But there may be some light at the end of the tunnel. Today, on the Board of County Commissioners' agenda was maybe a new financing tool, a modified tax increment financing proposal for use in infrastructure for mass transit, and so along the corridors and the smart lane. So we'll see how that goes. There's a fair amount of money from the federal government, and I know money is not always the issue, and sometimes it can fuel the problem, but certainly money is part of the issue. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I would make the point about broadening your tax base by increasing that density. You're going to have a lot more money that you can spend on infrastructure. And sure, maybe the sewer hookups need to be made, or the sewer pipes need to be made a little bit wider, but you're going to have a lot more taxpayers to help finance this. On the family sizes have shrunk. So schools are closing because they don't have enough kids. So, pointing that out, that moderately more density can be a positive. But then, kind of as Michael said, a lot of it comes down to planning too. And you could just plan this better and spend your money more wisely. That could go a long way.
I would just say, I'm not talking about the sewers, I'm talking about the roads.
Yeah.
Right, being wider.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I would say, is there a way to try to plan ahead a little bit to account for the expanding the infrastructure first before we have total gridlock and allow people in. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, build the infrastructure first before we build the housing units.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to trade-offs, right? I mean, has the pendulum swung a little bit too far and people are already getting priced out? And, in Miami, that's less of an issue. But in other, particularly out in California, people are living on the streets because home prices are too high, rents are too high. And, what do we want? And, I don't know about the streets. I mean, in Palisades Park, for example, much smaller place, they were able to deal with it by a little bit better planning and slowing down the traffic at times. And, not that it's perfect, but also, kind of maybe, I mean, you're also bringing people closer to the jobs. So you could be cutting down on the cars that are needed. And, kind of to the extent you can improve your public transit a little bit, it's not going to be perfect, but it's a way of mitigating this. I don't know, Michael, do you have any?
I agree basically what you're leading to and what Tobias indicated. If local government would put more resources into infrastructure development in areas where they do see or believe that development will be occurring or should be occurring, you will have better development rather than waiting for the stuff to come up or the people to apply for it and then putting in the money. But again, it comes down to money and, are the voters going to be willing to see that investment when they don't see anything being built, but you have a new road and, things are being widened, or you have a new spur on the tri-rail or metro rail being built using our tax dollars for the future development, which may make life easier overall, but do the voters make that connection? And that's the challenge. That's the challenge.
Okay, we have one last question here.
Thank you. Well, first I wanted to thank you for the examples and the information you gave. It makes me think. The personal area where I have interest is accessory dwelling units in use. And I have mainly two questions. One is, what is Miami or Miami-Dade doing to promote that as a solution? And the second one is how we as a community can help in speed it up so that maybe one good example that comes to my mind, though is in California, is Los Angeles, where they built 12,000 last year. And what do we need to do as a community, maybe not to get to that number, but to improve the numbers that we have here as a solution of attainable housing. So.
Miami-Dade County, there's actually an article about this in the Miami Herald about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I thought it was a terrible article because it did a very bad job of explaining what the county's workforce housing ordinance is all about and how a portion of that ordinance allows for the building of 3 units on lots that normally would only have 1 unit. And it's a good idea. It's an ADU idea, but there is a flaw. There is a flaw. And that is there is a payment in lieu of construction aspect to it. In other words, you can pay a certain amount of money to the county based on a formula, and then not having to, and then you don't have to actually build those 1 or 2 extra units. So instead, what developers are doing is that they're paying that money and they're knocking down that house and then they're building the McMansion on it, to really make, the killing that they think that they wish to. So that detracts from the actual increase of number of units that you have. And that needs to be cleaned up. But the concept is there. It's not being promoted, but a lot of developers, smaller developers from out of town have figured it out. They're taking advantage of it. There have been some good examples of good projects that have come up, but it's there and it's available. And there was actually, there's plans to allow lots as small as 7,500 square feet to, as of right, have an extra unit built on that site. And they haven't done it yet, but it's written into law that it will be coming. Hopefully there won't be a payment in lieu option that would then allow, again, some slick developers to take advantage of that situation.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this beforehand, and just to, kind of, in some areas, ADUs are not the highest and best use. What do you mean by highest and best use? Well, what you can support on that parcel. And in that instance that Michael just mentioned, where developers are paying the fee and building McMansions, it's probably because you're not allowing high enough density. So maybe instead of allowing 3 ADUs, you should be allowing 6 townhomes in that area. And that may change the economics, that instead of building the McMansion, you are building, 4, 5, 6 townhomes on that parcel. And you can you can make more profit by doing that. That's one. Ultimately, you should the market decide what's best on that parcel, right? I mean, is it an ADU? Is it townhomes? But you should give the individual the choice. Particularly why LA has been so successful is because they've implemented the shot clocks. If you don't hear from the planning department within 60, 90 days or whatever, consider you can go ahead. And then also the pre-approved design standards where they have, I forget how many, but they have 20 or more pre-approved design standards where you can just pick one and then you can go ahead and build it by right.
The payment in lieu of option also allows for that owner or developer to build the 3 units, but then without the restrictions on rent that come with being able to develop those extra units. So they either go, we're not going to build what we promised, we'll build a big house, make a lot of money off of that on the sale of that, or fine, we will build those 2 extra units, but we're no longer restricted by the affordability requirements that come under the ordinance if you follow it as it's fine.
Thank you, guys. Let's give a round of applause for I really want to thank Michael and Tobias for being here and really offering so much valuable information to us, and a lot for us to think about and process here. I also want to thank our friends at American Enterprise Institute, AEI. I actually personally did the AEI Fellows Program in 2019, and it was really fantastic. They bring me up to Washington, D.C. for a couple days, and you hear from like 50 Tobiases, all super good. Sorry about that. All sorts of different issues are covered and things like that. So it's really, and you get to meet amazing other fellows. I don't know, there must have been 100 people in our cohort there for a few days. So it was really great. So if you don't know Chris, or if you're not familiar with AEI yet, I encourage you. And also, it's great because Chris lives in Washington, D.C., but he's a member of the Economic Club of Miami because he's down here so much. And actually, I was just traveling with him in Argentina about a month ago. So really, really fun to see what Javier Milay's doing down there now. But anyway, really want to thank everybody. If you're also new and you're not familiar with the Economic Club of Miami, there's a lot of other members here. You can be a member of the club. We do events, throughout the year. We're a little bit lighter in the summer, just like Chris said with AEI down here in Miami. But we will have a very robust fall schedule. And in fact, I was just talking to some of our partners over at the Miami Downtown Development Authority today about transportation. So I'm so glad that came up. So I think we also do, in addition to these sort of public ticketed events, we do member networking events as well, including some cool opportunities. So we're actually looking to kind of explore the transportation infrastructure of Miami together with our friends over there at the Miami Downtown Development Authority, maybe later this summer. So stay tuned for that. And again, you can talk to me about anything. And also, for some of you that were with us for our first full day conference, Miami Economic Forum, we did a full day finance investing conference. Big focus on emerging markets, big focus on Latin America. We had about 40-something speakers in one day on one stage, believe it or not, and we actually finished 10 minutes early. But we just announced the save the date for the next year. It'll be February 7th. So it's a full day event. Please mark your calendar and join us. We've got some really exciting speaker announcements that are going to be rolled out very soon on that. So stay tuned. But thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thanks to our friends here at Biscayne Brewing Company. And I don't think it can be forgotten that we're in an old building, the old post office building that was revitalized. Commercial real estate now taking over here. But I couldn't help but remark how many cranes are just around this one building with all the new housing and other buildings, office buildings going up. So we are building here in Miami. So we'll have to take some notes from these two gentlemen on how to do that smart. So thank you all for being here and hope you have a good rest of your night.